Before I introduce today's distinguished panelists, I just want to talk a little bit about the issue that's brought us all here together, why it's important, and why NACD believes that now is the time to focus on it. Climate change is an urgent challenge, I think one that threatens the sustainability of business, and one that is a complex issue that requires boards to grapple with scientific, macroeconomic, policy issues, as well as uncertainties overall. Boards find it difficult to sometimes frame climate risks and opportunities properly without the larger strategy of the organization. It's also no secret that companies' stakeholders, customers, employees, and shareholders alike, increasingly expect that organizations and board members operate as good stewards of the earth. Many of them are counting on boards to provide the oversight required to transition to a net zero carbon economy, while at the same time creating value in this new business landscape. So NACD believes that boards should be empowered with the resources that they need to incorporate climate issues into company strategy and to be able to position themselves to act on the new opportunities that policy, regulatory, and operational changes will likely bring. So that's why NACD has joined the Climate Governance Initiative, or CGI, a global project in collaboration with the World Economic Forum and as the CGI's US host chapter. I'm sure, Peter, you'll tell us a little bit more about that development. But the CGI's network of national and regional chapters works to empower directors to gain climate awareness and skills, embed climate considerations into board decision-making, and to understand and act upon the risks and opportunities that the climate emergency poses to the long-term resilience and success of their companies. So with all that said, today's panelists bring a wealth of experience and knowledge to this discussion, and I'm really delighted and honored to introduce them to you now. I hope this discussion will resonate with you all and will help you start or deepen the climate conversations that I'm sure are happening in your own boardrooms. So first, I'd like to introduce you to Ted Craver, who serves as a director on the boards of Wells Fargo and Duke Energy. Ted is also the former chair, president, and CEO of Edison International, a public utility holding company. Next, we have Peter Gleason, who is NACD's CEO and a recognized expert on board leadership and corporate governance. He's also the past chair of the Global Network of Director Institutes. And then finally, please welcome Mindy Lubber, who's the global thought leader and the president and CEO of sustainability and nonprofit organization, Ceres. Ceres works to mobilize the most influential investors and companies to tackle the world's biggest sustainability challenges, including, of course, climate change. Just last year, Mindy received the Champions of the Earth Award, the highest environmental honor from the United Nations. So it would certainly take probably the entire session to cover all these panelists' many accomplishments. But if you'd like more information about their background and experience, there was a know before you go email that you should have received yesterday, which includes links to the panelists' full bios. So with that said, I'd like to kick things off. So let's start with the big question. Why now? Why should boards be paying attention? So Peter, I'm going to start with you and throw that to you, and then let Mindy and then Ted respond. So take it away, Peter.
All right. Well, thanks, Julian, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's great to see so many familiar faces on the gallery view in front of me. Your question is the big question, Julian. And I look at it as we're really at an inflection point around climate change. It's no longer just a social or ethical or environmental issue, but it's now very much material to the long-term prospects of our businesses. It's posing significant risks, and it's offering new opportunities for growth. And I think that's a critical component of the dialogue that we're about to have. But it's clear that we're facing, if not about to face, a wave of regulatory and investor demands that are going to force companies to shift their long-term strategies and become more transparent, specifically about their emissions. And we also look at this as a financial and a systemic risk, as well as a factor that's integral to the value creation of the companies in which we serve. So And this is an emphasis point for me, and I'll probably hit it again in subsequent questions, but whether you believe in climate change or not personally is irrelevant. Given the business environment that we're operating in right now, it's a risk that all companies face and that boards need to treat as such within the dialogue of enterprise risk management. It's become an issue where directors have to apply their fiduciary duties on behalf of the company, shareholders, and its stakeholders. And I think that's critical to the ongoing thinking about how we're addressing climate change. So if we look at it as, climate change is an enterprise risk multiplier, and it's aggravating many of the risks that are already being dealt with by management and the board. And, if you think about, physical and business continuity risks, obviously we've got an impact there. We have investor risks. So, now the mainstream investors, the institutional investors, have integrated climate risk into their long-term investment decision-making criteria, and that may affect the company's ability to raise capital. So I just mentioned the regulatory or the potential wave of regulatory risks that we're facing and compliance risks that'll go along with that. And then you've got competitive risks on top of that. And, if you think about consumers and your staff, your employees, they can leave very easily for competitors who can demonstrate more of a commitment or an impact from the company's perspective on climate issues. So as companies get more active around climate governance, and boards are going to need continuous learning on the issue. So, we've got multiple steps ahead of us. And the education component of this is actually huge when you think about the complexity of climate change. You've got the science issues, obviously. You've got the policy environment that's going to take place, and how we're seeing that from a policy and regulatory, environment. And right now, I think about climate competence, and I think about the factor of where that competence lies in the board, and I think it's few and far between. So we're going to have to bring directors up to speed on these issues. They're going to need to focus in on education, how it's impacting them, so they can become conversant. I mean, liken it to cybersecurity 10, 12 years ago in terms of the board's ability to have that discussion in the boardroom with the experts. So we've got a lot of work to do. And that's really Julian, you were talking about the why we joined the Climate Governance Initiative by the World Economic Forum. They laid out the principles that they're looking for, but this is really about education. It is about bringing directors up to speed to have the dialogues that are necessary in order to address this risk. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Peter. Well, speaking of education, I know, Mindy, this is something your organization does a lot. Could you maybe weigh in?
Sure, absolutely, and thank you. We now know what perhaps we didn't know 5 years ago, but we know that the science is clear, the economics is clear, that climate presents a planetary, a human, and a financial risk to our economy. And I'd start by saying there's almost no sector or company that is left unharmed as climate grows and has its impact. If you think about the insurance sector and what it means to have had $18 billion plus storms. What does it mean to an electric utility company when fires have broken out on the West Coast and there's criminal and multi-billion-dollar charges filed? Every sector of our economy is affected. And at this point, I think we can say the financial risks of climate are so severe, they are material. They pose a threat to our financial markets. And we are learning right now. If COVID has taught us anything, it is the interrelationship between all of these issues, from public health to the economy. We see what a financial systemic risk looks like. We know that we don't want another one. We don't want to be brought to our knees. And boards need to look at systemic risk. It belongs on their agenda. There is no company, no sector, no industry that's not going to be impacted. And as I said, we've learned that from the pandemic. Each company is going to be different. What it means to a transportation company that's going through one of the most major transformations ever, moving from combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles. Profound impact on strategy, on impact on short, medium, and long-term finances of a company if you're an auto company. And I could provide those examples for every sector. So there's no company that's not in and of itself impacted, the sector is not impacted, and the interrelationships. If you're a bank, it's not only what your emissions are as a bank. We know that banks don't create large emissions, but every investment they make around the globe impacts their stability, their portfolios. And so we've got a company sectoral, and as I said, a systemic risk. The second thing is the global context of the regulatory world has radically changed. In the EU, there are mandatory provisions being put into place related to climate change, all of which relate to companies and relate to investments. Here in the United States, for the first time ever, Janet Yellen, our Treasury Secretary, has made climate change a priority. She has put it on the agenda of the FSOC, the Federal Stability Boards, the SEC, the Federal Reserve. She has hired a staff team to look at this. And every federal regulatory agency is now looking at what does it mean in addition to what's going on in the EU. The Fed identified climate change just recently as a stability risk. They appointed a climate supervision and a stability council to address this from a macro-prudential and a micro-prudential perspective. And the SEC, which impacts every company or every publicly traded company, has clearly identified climate change as a priority. I think what we're going to see is mandatory climate risk disclosure, all of which comes back to how is a company in a comprehensive way managing climate risk, building it into its strategic plan, into its goals. And clearly we all know that the board in the end is the bottom line for as a company, have the right goals, the right strategic plan, and is it moving in the right direction?
Thank you, Mindy. Well, I mean, that's a good segue to you, Ted, because you sit on the boards of two very significant organizations, and you've been a CEO of a very meaningful private sector company. What's your take on this, Ted?
Well, I think Peter and Mindy have covered a lot of the key points in terms of why now. I mean, clearly, customers, investors, regulators, all of them are expecting companies to face and address this issue. But I think increasingly, they're expecting companies to do something about climate change, not just talk about it. So the transition to a net zero carbon economy is huge. I really can't think of anything that would be larger than trying to deal with the size of the transition and the disruption that comes from that. And I think with any disruption, the risks come out of the magnitude of it, as well as the pace with which you have to adjust. And from my perspective, when you have a transition of that magnitude, there always are as many opportunities that come with that as there are risks and potential harm to the company. So I think boards really need to weigh in by constantly asking the question, not just where are the risks, but where are the opportunities? How can we position the company, reposition in some cases, in other cases it's adjust, but how can we address those opportunities? And from my perspective, when you're faced with a transition like that, there is an advantage to early movers. There clearly are risks to first movers and there are risks to late movers, but for my money, I'd rather be associated with a company that's going to be more in the early mover category. Gives you time to more time to create the strategies for pivoting. It gives you more of an opportunity to make adjustments along the way. And as Peter was mentioning, it gives the boards more time to come up the learning curve and really refine how they're going to make those adjustments. So I think it's pretty clear the why now is because it is mandatory, it is important to move in that direction, but also there are some significant opportunities that you can capture if you are one of the early movers.
Well, that's actually a really good segue into our next question, Ted, and I'm going to call on you first. And that is, in the past, there are many directors and C-suite officers who've said that, they cannot turn away, understandably, from profit by focusing on climate concerns. and it would be, breaching their fiduciary duty to their shareholders. So how would you all respond to kind of those objections now? How can companies balance that, their responsibility to create value for their shareholders in the now, with the responsibility to manage future risk, while still competing on a level playing field with competitors that may not have had the same concerns or restrictions, whether here or abroad? So again, Ted, I'd like to have you start with that, and then Peter, and then Mindy.
Okay. Well, certainly companies have a responsibility to deliver profits and good returns to their investors. I think that's a given. We all understand that. But I would say also boards, in my opinion, are quite familiar with balancing competing interests, balancing competing priorities, and dealing with important timeframes for making major adjustments, major changes to the company. That's kind of part and parcel of board activity. As I said just a few minutes ago, one of the prime things that I'm trying to communicate here today is I think it's important for boards to kind of put themselves in the mindset that there are as many opportunities associated with a transition of this sort as there are risks. And it's important for the boards to kind of focus on that side in a balanced way, along with where the risks are. Regarding the level playing field, that one, at least as I perceive it, I think it's fairly level playing field within the United States. We all are facing essentially just different versions of the same imperatives from customers, investors, regulators, the populace as a total. And I think largely speaking, certainly in the industries that I'm most involved in, energy, financial services, I see Europe really in a similar stance. If anything, I think Europe has been more insistent on companies making these changes. Maybe it's a little more of a complicated situation in terms of level playing field competing in Asia. I think that's kind of yet to be really seen in terms of how some of those adjustments might take place. But either way, I think this is something that is a global issue, and it's something that all companies, regardless of their domicile, are going to have to deal with. So from my standpoint, again, look for the opportunities as much as look for the risks, and there's an advantage to being one of the early movers.
Fantastic, Ted. Peter, what's your take on balancing this issue?
Well, I think we've got to look at the ecosystem as a whole. I talked about the institutional investors in the last segment, and this is now mainstream. We have $40 trillion in assets under management that's driving companies to align their portfolio companies with the net zero emissions targets. So, and it is starting to create a level playing field, as Ted said. And, we've even seen, recently we've seen China committing to reducing emissions. So in addition to Europe, which is probably a couple steps ahead of us, as Ted said, we're starting to see China fall into play too, in terms of commitments. Now, we've got to wait and see the output, but the commitment is there. Another point that, I want to focus in on is competition is no longer entirely driven by price and cost, but by reputation and brand as well. And, key talent and customers are drawn to companies that are doing something around sustainability. So I took a look at an IBM survey that was run in 2020, and nearly 6 in 10 consumers surveyed are willing to change their shopping habits to reduce environmental impact. That's kind of amazing when you think about it. And nearly 8 in 10 indicate sustainability is important to them. And for those that say it's really important, they're willing to pay a premium for products. So you're talking about a price premium of up to 35% on average for brands that are sustainable and environmentally responsible. So you've got a different level of competition that you've got to think about now from a reputational standpoint, from a customer standpoint. And we're also starting to see competitors collaborating, which is fascinating. There are 3 major chemical distributors that have collaborated to come up with a different way of, they signed a joint agreement to develop electrically heated steam cracker furnaces. I'm not in the chemical industry, but I understand that that's part of how they develop their product. And when you've got competitors joining forces to look at how this will impact their sustainability, how their emissions outputs will be there, they're talking about this, electricity from renewable resources can potentially reduce greenhouse emissions by as much as 90% in the production of those chemicals. So we're seeing competitors band together to take steps forward. So a lot of different movement there. And I think that's critical as we think about, what are boards responsible to in terms of their fiduciary duties and delivering returns to their shareholders. There are different ways to think about this as we move forward.
Thanks, Peter. Mindy, what's your take?
Well, I want to start with this notion that acting on climate means you take a haircut on profits is false, is not substantiated by facts. Maybe somebody could find a fact related to one company out of the Fortune 500 or the Russell 2000. I haven't seen it. Let's be clear. The notion that there is a choice between values and value creation has been put to bed. And I do think we need to start with that. The evidence is clear. It grows more every day that climate change poses a clear and present risk to companies. Not acting on climate is what creates risk exposure, not acting on it. And we've talked a bit about investors. Of the investors we work with, of the 198 investor members in North America who are part of Ceres Investor Network on Climate Risk and the 545 globally, they are acting, and they are acting in concert. 87 investors, some of the largest asset managers, including State Street, BlackRock, Vanguard, have promised to work with their clients to reach net zero emissions by 2050, with very clear guidelines along the way. And 500 of our investor members, representing $54 trillion in assets, are members of Climate Action 100+, an initiative where these 500 plus investors have come together, said climate is a financial risk, and we are going to work with every company in our portfolio, starting with the 100 plus largest emitters, to act on climate. And we're going to work with them, directly with them, but they're also all poised to file shareholder resolutions should those discussions not move forward. Secondly, the facts beyond what asset owners, asset managers, and others in the financial sector are doing. An analysis of about 500 of the largest global companies estimated that the financial implications from climate change related impacts found $1 trillion at risk, and half of those risks anticipated to materialize in the next 5 years. I mean, we all used to think climate change was 10 years off, 20 years off. We had time to act. I think the important point is when we're looking at $1 trillion risks within the next 5 years, we need to be making decisions today. Every day we don't act, the problem gets worse and the problem gets more expensive to mitigate. And research recently from the S&P found that companies in the S&P 500 index own physical assets across 68 countries globally. 60% of these entities hold assets that are high risk right now from climate change. So inaction is actually bad for business. And on the flip side, as we heard from my colleagues, there are clearly investment opportunities. It is not only about risk, it's not only about how to mitigate that risk, but we know we need investments in climate change solutions. We know there are huge opportunities in front of us. We know that equity indexes that have been in this space have done well. Nobody is looking to lose money. Nobody is looking to take a haircut. But the bottom line is the science is clear, the economics is clear, and we now have the returns that are showing us acting on climate makes sense and not acting on it does not make sense. And you know, when Larry Fink is out writing in his quarterly letters, Larry Fink, obviously from BlackRock, $6.9 trillion in assets, that looking and acting on climate makes sense and ought to be done, and that companies that don't act will be voted against on shareholder resolutions by a $6.7 trillion giant. Those are messages that boards need to digest, need to act on, and of course, need to move forward yesterday rather than 3 years from now.
Thank you, Mindy. Well, given that we are based in the Washington, D.C. area, we need to obviously pivot to a question around the administration. So with the current administration, adding a climate envoy for national security. I think the first member of the National Security Council to focus exclusively on climate change. I think it appears fairly certain that this administration is determined to make climate a key part of its agenda. Therefore, what should boards keep in mind or expect as this administration shapes their climate policy? And Mindy, I'm going to start with you and then Peter and Ted.
Sure. It was just last week when Climate Envoy Kerry, former Senator Kerry and former Secretary of State Kerry, announced that the US was pushing forward to achieve a 50 to 52% reduction in economy-wide net greenhouse gas pollution by 2030. That's around the corner. That's 9 years. It's not the early 2050. That goal will be impacting every sector of our economy, and it will be pushed for federal policy by every agency. And we are now at a point, and I think we've talked about it, people used to think that climate would be debated at the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Energy, the Department of the Interior. We're involved in discussions right now, literally every day, with the Department of the Treasury, and Janet Yellen in her nomination process before the United States Congress or Senate basically said she will make climate a priority, and she already has. And they're looking at every federal financial agency, which impacts every company that we're talking about. Last week, in support of Senator Kerry, we brought 420 company and investor CEOs to support these substantial reductions, fully realizing that they'll have an impact. But let's just look at the US regulators that have engaged in the last 2 months. Areas that were not discussed even 6 months ago. We've seen the Fed affirm that climate change is a systemic risk, and they put in place the supervision committee that I mentioned before, but they are now involved. We've seen the SEC call for comments on mandatory climate risk disclosure. They're accepting comments now. There's every reason to believe they will be considering regulations to impose mandatory climate risk disclosure, which again impacts every company that we're talking about. We saw the Commodities Future Trading Commission do a climate risk study with 32 diverse backgrounds. I happen to have been on that Commodities Future Trading Risk report, but that report called for mandatory climate risk disclosure and engage in climate risk at every federal financial agency. So it is a different day. The Congress may consider a price on carbon. A price on carbon, again, will impact all of us, every part of our financial sector. But even if that doesn't move forward immediately, we know many other regulatory agencies are. So now is the time to get prepared, not wait to be told what to do. You either have, get involved in the process or you're told what to do. I think now is the time for boards to be involved with the process. What is the role of the Fed? Where should they come down? In Europe, the Federal Reserve equivalent has moved forward on mandate and climate risk. We will see that. And I think the movement seems to be going fast. Everything we hear, all the briefings we've gotten from the administration is that, like everything else this administration has done, it's going to move fast, move strong, and try and make a difference, while at the same time involving all the constituencies that need to be involved. So, if there were ever a time to lean in and act now, as a company, as a board, as a community, now is that time.
Thank you, Mindy. Peter, what's your take?
Well, I agree 100% with what Mindy just said. And it's hard to evaluate what the scope of the compliance changes are going to be, because we've got multiple different entities that are chiming in on this, maybe outside of the fact that we're pretty sure that the SEC, given that they're in the comment period now, they're going to come out with some more transparency requirements and what companies. But in terms of to Mindy's point, now's the time to act. What should boards be thinking about right now? I think about ensuring that climate risk identification and evaluation is embedded into the ERM systems and that has a clear owner within the management team. So somebody has to own this within the management team to funnel this reporting through, right? You need to consider putting on the agenda for the board within 3 to 6 months, and maybe faster than that, given the urgency that Mindy just articulated. You've got to do this now. You've got to really be thinking about how are we going to look at these issues. So 3 to 6 months maybe a little too late given the speed with which a lot of this is happening, but put it on the agenda quickly for the board. And then you've got to really think about the net zero transition roadmap for the company and how it links to the multi-year strategic plan. So how do you integrate this into the strategic planning of the organization? And then you got to have this periodic reporting that's got to happen from management to the board, and make sure that, you know, that's a regular ongoing dialogue that's going to happen, and that the board's fully aware. And the big question is, you know, what company do we want to be in a net zero economy? So what's our potential business model look like? What are the opportunities that are ahead of us? And, you know, maybe almost fixate less on the specific targets and dates, but think about what strategically are we going to have to do differently, and how are we going to approach this? You've got your committee structure in place. You know, I tend to look at this as a full board, you know, opportunity, but the committees play a significant role. So you got to go through and look at the relevant committees of the board. You've got risk, you've got audit, nom gov, the oversight role to ensure that climate risk is really well managed and integrated into the company's long-term planning. A lot of that happens at the committee level. So what are the specific responsibilities that each committee is going to take on, and the full board as well? So, and then you probably need to start discussions with the general counsel and the CFO about the readiness for the new disclosure regime that we're going to be faced with, and the requirements that we're going to be faced with, and the implications for the accounting and financial reporting that are, you know, along with that. So I think there are some steps you can take right now to start preparing for a little bit of the unknown, given the multiple agencies that are involved in this and the speed with which this is happening.
Thanks, Peter. Ted, what's your perspective?
Well, you're asking what the Biden administration and what some of the political initiatives would be. I maybe focus on two. One, the first step is companies assessing what their risks are and identifying those and being able to talk about those, communicate those to the public and to investors. The second half of that is more and more companies are coming out with commitments. Both of the boards that I sit on, over the last 2 years, there have been, you know, actual commitments that have been made regarding net zero carbon. So when you make commitments, I think you really come to that point of how are you going to compare these companies one to the other? How are investors, how are the public going to actually assess how they're doing against those commitments? And that's the area that I think has been most lacking at this point. A number of industry groups have gone out and tried to form organizations that will allow them to identify approaches for communicating and comparing standards, if you will, for disclosure. But that's you know, kind of a hodgepodge when you really think about it. What you need is some commonality in the standards and the disclosure methods, and ultimately the companies have to be able to implement how they're going to put their disclosures forward and how they're going to mark progress against the commitments they've made. So this whole standard setting and setting what the disclosure requirements are going to be, to me, that would be a major service to all of the companies, all the public companies in particular. The second area, which is totally different, is technology. From the work that I've seen, it certainly has left me with the impression that we're not going to really solve the problem of getting to net zero in some of the industries in particular without some significant advances in technologies. We probably can meet a lot of Paris Accord type requirements or commitments, goals out to 2035. But the closer we get to 2050, I think the more difficult it is to get those last pieces in place. And that's where we really need technological advance. And I think the government has a role to play in that. I'm more familiar with it from the Department of Energy and the national labs, but there's a tremendous opportunity, I think, to put some real investment behind the technology development side. both on the government behalf as well as on private companies. So those two areas would be ones that I would add in.
Hey, Ted. So I'm going to throw out one more question, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience. So all of you out there listening, if you want to start thinking about what questions you might want to ask. But before that, so if my board or members of my board or perhaps even my management team are skeptical and perhaps downplay the urgency of addressing this challenge, how can I, as a director, kind of break through that force field, that inertia, and get them to act? How should these conversations happen, both at the committee level, but also at the full board level? Ted, perhaps you can take this one first, then I'm going to have Mindy and then Peter respond.
Well, I don't really intend to dodge the question, but I honestly, in my experience with Wells Fargo, with Duke Energy, I haven't seen any of that recalcitrance on the part of the board or management, for that matter. Duke made a commitment to net zero back in 2019, so net zero emissions by 2050. Wells Fargo has also made that same commitment, and in fact added to it, as Mindy was talking about earlier. Their commitment is net zero by 2050, including financed emissions. So not just their own emissions, but financed emissions. And both companies have made a number of other commitments and initiatives to support that. So actually, from my perspective, I haven't seen the recalcitrance on the part of the boards. But I would say if companies are experiencing that, or directors feel that they don't have the full attention of the board in that regard, again, that's a responsibility that we have. Boards are supposed to be diverse. They're supposed to have diverse thinking. And it's important to have the courage along with that to raise the issues that need to be raised, and do it in a format that is constructive. And I think one of the ways to do that is, again, to ask the question of where are the opportunities in this transition? There are significant opportunities for every company in this transition. I think Peter covered a lot of it in response to one of the earlier questions in terms of the various committees and how the board would do that. But certainly the three core committees, nominating, corporate governance, audit, and compensation, it's clear all three of those committees have work to do in support of taking action on climate. The ones that I'm most familiar with recently have been audit, and I've spoken to that a little bit earlier. Getting standards and having disclosures that are really robust, and very importantly, having the controls around the statements that are made, around the data that is given, around the progress being made in support of the commitments. That's something that the audit committees are kind of front and center in. Compensation, if we're really going to make progress, we need to tie this into the compensation of executives. I see corporate governance as really kind of the quarterback, making sure that all of the roles and responsibilities are understood amongst the committees and that charters are updated to do that. But the final point I would make is this is a full board responsibility, in my opinion. The full board needs to be engaged. So there's committee work that needs to be done, but the bulk of the conversations, I think, really need to take place at the full board.
Excellent, Ted. Mindy, what would you add to that, or how would you advise boards to break through that inertia if they're experiencing some of that?
Well, the first thing I would say is, as a lawyer, which I am, but I'm not advising all of your boards, one of the duties of a corporate board member and a corporate board is to analyze risk. It's foremost, it's a fiduciary duty, it's not negotiable. And when we're looking at the kind of economic risk, systemic risk, when we're looking at how consumers are now responding, how employees are responding, I know the investor world, because that's where we spend most of our time, and I can say with certainty, they are looking at every company and examining their climate competency and capability and goals. These are risks that matter to competitiveness, to profit, to going forward, and so on. And finally, what I hear out there in the ecosphere, it's not the world we live in, the number of legal cases that are now being looked at for boards that are not operating under their fiduciary duty. So there are enough risks that would tell all of us act. The time to act is now. I think a few things that Ted said. One is acting means there needs to be a formality to it. There needs to be a board committee. There need to be goals. The CEO needs to prepare a study and report on what kind of actions. And I agree with Ted, compensation should be tied to those goals. Somehow, if we only tie compensation to profits or number of cars sold or whatever, we are immediately reducing it to a non-priority issue. And again, I'm not saying it should jump over other things, but people do what they're paid to do. And I would tie compensation. I would make sure that the next 1 or 2 board members bring some competency. They don't have to be a climate scientist. They don't have to be a climate lawyer, but bring a competency to analyze, to looking at these issues. I'd be very proactive as a board for anyone. You know, I hear from investors every day that companies aren't sharing what they're doing on climate. I'd advise every board and every company when they're doing their earnings calls and where they're meeting with their investors to talk proactively about what they're doing, because then the rest of the organization understands it. And keep that dialogue going. So for me, is the time is to act now. I think there's no question there's a risk. Maybe the board will determine for a particular company the risk isn't great and an action plan isn't needed. At least it could be shown that it was deliberated, thought through, and a decision was made given a unique circumstance. But otherwise, given the impact across our economy, I think boards need to make sure that companies are putting in place transition plans, climate action plans that are metrics driven, that have short, medium, and long-term goals, and that are entirely transparent.
Thanks, Mindy. Peter, you have the last word on this one.
Well, thanks, Julian. And I think about the last word, and I'm going to repeat a lot of what Ted and Mindy just said because it's so relevant, and they're right, they're spot on. So but I might take a little different tact and put it into a different realm of risk here. This isn't personal belief. It's not politics. It has to be framed right. The discussion has to be framed right to get over some of those barriers, because they can be emotional, they can be politicized, and you need to take that off the table, because board level climate discussions should be held through the lens of risk and opportunities. That's what we've been talking about through this whole discussion. And how is that going to affect the long-term prospects of the business? These are issues that companies have to face head on. So, your beliefs and whether you're not going to buy into this doesn't matter. Again, it's what I said at the onset of this discussion. But the other factor to consider is this impacts your company because it impacts your shareholders and your stakeholders. So that vast debate of whether it's stakeholder primacy or shareholder primacy, the answer here is yes, because it impacts everybody, right? So you've got to really think about that constituent or those constituents, because they can vote with their feet. As I talked about, your staff, your employees look at priorities differently, and they can really make a decision to change their careers based on what they see the company doing. So in addition to the operational, the investment risk, the systemic risk, the regulatory risk, you've got a reputation risk. And that's another lens to look at this through in terms of what are we doing as an organization and how does that reflect what we do in the marketplace. So you need to think about, and boards need to think about and understand how our companies are going to be resilient in this type of environment, how their businesses will need to adapt, what are the potential new business opportunities that we should consider. And we have a duty to balance the short and the long-term needs and ensuring that we deliver on the purpose of the organization. So ultimately, this is going to be a balancing act for a lot of companies, especially as we're coming out of this pandemic. And we've got to look forward to what's the future of work look like. So.
Excellent, Peter. Well, look, I think this has been an incredibly rich and thoughtful discussion. And so for the remainder of the program, we're going to now toss it back to the audience for Q&A. I think we have time for at least one or two. I've seen a number of good questions come into the chat box, but Dave Oakley, who's our NACD regional director, has been monitoring them. and is going to assist me in facilitating the Q&A. So Dave, what have you curated?
Sure, it looks like three main themes are coming up in questions. One about standards, another kind of around this issue of carbon pricing, and then also expertise in the boardroom. So maybe to start with the question about standards, Margaret Lanshaw asked about this, about standards and metrics to be used by the management to guide and monitor a company's progress. And can the speakers provide guidance on how frameworks, guidance on how to navigate which frameworks tend to be used by BlackRock, State Street versus the United Nations and WEF, and why one framework may be more appropriate for specific industries than others. So I think it was coming out of Ted maybe made some comments there, but yeah, that's one question.
Yeah, I don't know these frameworks myself. Is there a big gap between them, or Mindy, I think you probably have studied all these. What's the delta, or are they pretty close?
So there's certainly a lot, and I'm not going to go through a full alphabet soup. With companies, we tend to expect the basis being science-based targets. There is something called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. It applies to almost all sectors. It certainly is one good place to look amongst others. Secondly, for investors, I think the starting place, the fundamental foundation is the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosure, put together by the financial sector, not by outside advocates, but creates the framework for what should be evaluated and what should be in, and what investors are looking for. Now, I do think the SEC will end up promulgating something, and it will have more clear mandatory rules. But those would be two places I would start. As a company, I'd be looking at science-based targets and the TCFD, and I know investors are looking at the TCFD in particular.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on that, or?
Maybe I'll put one piece in. As I mentioned, I think part of it is giving investors and the public an idea of where a company is in terms of sustainability, in terms of emissions and the like. The other part is, as more and more companies come out with commitments, being able to compare how those companies are actually keeping the scorecard against their commitments is, I think, an area that is particularly difficult right now. And small, pardon me, small groups of companies within industries are trying to kind of plug that hole. But this is where I think, and I'm thinking about it right at the moment in terms of financial services, when you make a commitment that you're going to have zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, net zero by 2050, including your financed emissions, how are you going to actually capture the financed emissions part? I mean, it's almost an arm's length type of experience. So trying to get some real meat around how we're going to be able to provide comparable information company to company on those types of commitments is, I think, the emerging area. Probably, I have to believe there are going to be some governmental regulations that ultimately start coming forward, but companies need to be engaged as early as possible, both individually and through industry groups, to try to get some common framework for allowing people to compare and map progress against these commitments in an auditable way.
So, and I would agree, it should be auditable. One other standard setter is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which provides another way to look at the data. But Ted, you're right, we need to be constantly monitoring. Of the 550 investors we work with, they did a benchmark of the 160 largest emitters 2 months ago. Analytical, clear, and they basically benchmarked the 160 largest emitters based on very clear standards. So there's a lot of information out there that's a start. But I will also say, and as you know from Wells Fargo, JP Morgan has 25 people working on this right now, Morgan Stanley, B of A. That work is being done. All are committing to not only a change by 2050, but they're all committing to short, medium, and long-term goals And that will require some very clear metrics. And I think they feel on the hot spot. They put themselves there purposefully because they want to honor those commitments. And we'll see standards over the next year.
Excellent. Peter, anything to add? If not,
I was going to be more in the concur category.
sure.
You know, first thing that came to mind was the TCFD and then SASB, and Mindy hit on both of those in terms of a framework that you can start looking at. But Ted, I think your point on the comparability as we move forward of, you know, looking at benchmarking against others. You know, we've talked about opportunities for the companies. I think there's going to be great opportunities for some analytical teams out there in the future to start really harnessing all this and reporting on it, much to Mindy's point of, you know, we're seeing so much activity here that I think we're going to see some really interesting frameworks come out in the next few years. So, excellent.
Great question. Great discussion. David, what's up next?
Oh, I think we've got these two other categories. One, let's maybe touch on carbon pricing. The question was, how do you see that implemented? And then there was also this sense about carbon pricing isn't going to make sense if the monies don't come back to the corporations to use to deal with CO2. If money's just going to go kind of basically back to the US Treasury, that could be counterproductive. How do you see boards trying to shape how this, you know, the carbon pricing and put it into a complementary approach?
The money question. Who wants to take that one?
Well, the only thing I would say, one is I don't see it happening in the next 6 months. I mean, we're involved in many of the congressional discussions about it, but which doesn't say anything in response in specific, but I would get involved. So I think this discussion is just being engaged, and there are many of us involved in it. I think there are a number of givens. One is a carbon price. One is there ought to be at some point, and designing it is key, a carbon price. Right now, carbon pollution costs society billions and billions and billions of dollars. When you price something at zero, you get more of it. It's simple economics. If we want capital markets to work, you have to have honest pricing signals. And we all know that. Now, of course, that's easily said, and the devil's in the details. The price has to be high enough to make a difference. So coming in with a carbon price at $10 a ton, 20 will not work. It's not worth doing. When you get to a high enough price, then of course the question is, how does it get disseminated? Where does the money go back to? I think a very big part of the debate and discussion will be equity, not only what goes back to companies, but what goes to communities that have been most harmed by climate pollution, equally as legitimate. So you raise good points. My only words of encouragement are get involved in the discussions and the debates because they're happening. And at some point, and I'm not suggesting the next 6 months, there will be a more active and live debate on climate pricing.
Who else would like to chime in on that one? Ted or Peter?
I guess only thing I would add, and it's really just to reemphasize what Mindy said. I think one of the core responsibilities that a board has is the allocation of resources, human resources, capital resources, et cetera. When you have something like carbon, which currently isn't very well priced in terms of what the trade-offs are, you're kind of missing a piece, and that ends up getting kind of substituted with mandates. So if you don't have a price for carbon, you typically have more kind of governmental influence coming in with either things like renewable resources mandates, certain percent of electricity has to be produced by renewables. It's not priced, it's just mandated that it must take place. And I think that makes it difficult when you go through and try to figure out how to allocate resources, and you get a lot of inefficiencies that get built in. So, of course, that's at the 100,000 foot level. The real hard work is trying to figure out how would you actually implement it, and what are the second order effects from having implemented, including how do you use proceeds. And we have a number of experiments or pilots in various states within the US that have attempted to do some of that work. I'd say there's a mixed level of progress in those, but we have things that we can learn from, and we'll see how this evolves over time.
Ted. Peter, anything to add, or?
No, I think that's I tend to look at this a little bit as, you know, the carrot and stick approach, you know, so how much of it is, you know, the price that we're going to pay, and to Mindy's point and Ted's point too, you know, where are those funds going back in, and, you know, how can they be used to positively impact the communities and or, you know, regions that have been impacted by the carbon output. So, you know, it's a little bit of, I think everybody's covered it pretty well, and I'm not going to add a whole lot to that discussion. So.
Perfect, Peter. David, I don't know if we have time for one more quick one, or I know we're hitting up at the end.
We're getting there. Maybe let's take a run at it real quickly and see. Maybe so. The third big group of questions was around expertise in the boardroom. Is specific expertise needed, or is it general education of the board? I know Peter talked about that a little bit, but also then kind of a flavor around, you know, what are our small and mid-cap companies going to do related to that, and even private companies, what's their role? So I think we can only cover a piece of that question.
That's a lightning round, so 30 seconds each. Who wants to go first? Who presses their buzzer? Peter?
I'll go first. You know, this is always a question that comes up with every topic of, should we have a board member who's an expert in this topic? So, you know, do we need a cyber expert? Do we need an environmental expert? Do we need an investment, you know, whatever the topic may be. And, you know, I hate to use the consulting phrase that, you know, everybody hears, but, you know, it depends. I think it depends on the level of carbon output that your company has and the impact that it could potentially have in the communities and where you operate. But I think education is the starting blocks of, you know, we've got to get the board conversant around these issues. So getting people up to speed on the issues, understanding the impacts, understanding the dialect that happens in all the different you know, we just talked ad nauseum about how much things are changing. And so you've got to bring people up to speed on the environment that they're operating in. So do we need, you know, an expert on climate? The answer is maybe. You might, depending on your industry, and you might be able to rely on the expertise of outside folks to come in and brief the board, make sure that we're up to speed. And I would always, you know, as NACD, I'm always going to focus on continuing education and keeping people current on what's going on in the environment.
You know, this may be unexpected from me. I don't know that you need a climate expert. It may be, look, smart generalists have to look at science, they have to look at economics, they have to look at data, they have to look at the landscape, they have to look at the legal issues. That's what board members do. Somebody needs to be charged with doing it and with being accountable and setting goals at a committee level and then bringing it to the full board. The last thing you want is, you know, this green person, the person anointed as, you know, the board member that came out of some green place, wind farm company, or God forbid, an environmental group, which of course I'm being sarcastic. They get diminished quickly. Like, of course you want the person who always has the label of green. This is not about green. It's not about anything. It's about fiduciary duty. It's about risk. It's about the strength of a company. And so you need somebody charged with it, but a smart person could read the literature, bring in the consultants, as you just heard, and come up working, of course, with the leadership of the company with the overall goals. And I think it's more important to make sure a committee is charged with doing that there's a timeline like there is for anything else. There's a staff that is supporting that committee, because we know that board members don't have the time to come up with the initial new work. But with that agreement, I'm not sure you want somebody who comes with a climate background, because a scientist can't deal with all the economics, and an economist, a good generalist who is charged with dealing with this, I think makes good sense.
Well, I know we're at time, but Ted, please.
No, I think we've covered it well.
Fantastic. Well, look, what a great discussion. Thank you all to our panelists for their thoughts and insights. For those of you who can bear with us for just 2 more minutes, I think we want to just, you know, share the fact that for those of you who are NACD fellows or NACD certified, You'll be receiving credit today for attending the program. So if you haven't registered to become NACD certified, do consider evaluating this credential to enhance your board profile and sharpen your director skills. You can express your interest in learning more about certification when you receive your survey that's going to follow the program. And then next up on our calendar is a special appreciation event on May 4th for NACD members and sponsors. And the NACD capital area, as one of the select number of hosts, has arranged for a virtual trip to Broadway for an exclusive behind-the-scenes experience with the cast and crew of the Pulitzer and Tony Award-winning production Hamilton. I've signed up already, I can't wait, including a live performance of some of the show's hit songs. We also invite you to join us for our May 13th event, which will be on international growth in the new era. This will be with us and the NACD Minnesota chapter as we tackle the geopolitical factors that directors are facing, and including trade policy, engagement with rising economic powers, and also a global pandemic. So finally, if you'd like to attend additional programming related to climate governance, the NACD Northern California chapter and the NACD Colorado chapter are hosting related programming on May 5th and 19th, as you'll see on this slide in front of you. After this event, you will receive an email that will ask you for your thoughts and feedback on this program that we just had, and we'll provide a link to register for that special members only Hamilton event that I mentioned, as well as the growth event, as well as the climate programming events on the 5th and the 19th. I think the NACD team has dropped the links into the chat box for your convenience. So with that, I really hope you enjoyed today's program. Thank you again so much to our speakers and David for a lively discussion. Thank you once again to our sponsors, again, without whom we would not have been able to share this timely and important programming with you. We hope to see you soon at another program in the near future. Stay well, everyone. Take care.